were your heroes as a child? Maybe yours was a historical figure like Abraham Lincoln, or maybe a military leader like General George Patton, or maybe some inspirational person who just rose above it all like Helen Keller. I was an early product of the television era, so my heroes were on the screen for me to watch. My first hero, as with most boys, was Superman. What little boy doesn't want to be faster than a speeding bullet and more powerful than a locomotive and able to leap tall buildings in a single bound? I loved Superman, and I was so inspired by him that I wanted to be him. And so one day at age 5, I climbed up on the back of our garage, taking with me 2 kites. I put one arm through and grabbed the balsa wood cross pieces of one kite and put the other arm through and grabbed the balsa wood cross pieces of the other kite. And I envisioned myself flying like Superman. I really had this view in my imagination of me flying above our backyard, back and forth. My parents with their mouths agape, the dog running and barking, neighbors coming out of their houses and pointing, "Look in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's the neighbor kid." And so I jumped. And of course, I fell like a rock. Fortunately, I didn't break anything except the 2 kites. It's a good thing I didn't try to stop a bullet. As an older child, I grew enamored with Tarzan. That garage experience had taught me that there's no such thing as superpowers. And so I wanted a superhero that was more human, maybe just with some extraordinary human ability. And so I watched every Tarzan movie I could. I read Edgar Rice Burroughs' novel about the Lord of the Jungle. In the back of that book, there was a section that contained all the words that Tarzan had spoken in some who knows what language to the animals and the tribal people. About 100 vocabulary words complete with definitions, and I memorized every one of them. Whenever I could, I worked those words into a conversation with my parents. It drove them nuts, which was what I was going for. I loved watching Tarzan wrestle a crocodile and tame a lion and beat up tribes full of bad guys. But what I most loved was watching him swing through the jungle on a grapevine. So at age 12, I one day climbed up into the top branches of a huge maple tree in my grandparents' front yard, and I tied off a long rope. I was going to be Tarzan that day. And so I got back quite a distance, and I sprinted as fast as I could for about 50 yards to work up to maximum momentum. And I grabbed that rope, and I leaped for the sky, and I swung way up into the branches, higher than I had expected. It took me by surprise. And I panicked, and I let loose of the rope. There was no grapevine to grab. I was about 15 feet in the air for a very short period of time. And then I fell like a rock again, but this time I broke my right arm. Imitating heroes has not worked out well for me. We do that, don't we, though? We imitate our heroes. Why is that? An article I read on National Lifestyle website suggests it's because we want to control what's going on in our world, but we don't have the ability. And so heroes provide us the hope that someone good and decent can. And so we admire them and we aspire to be them. Heroes who are normal-looking people with vulnerabilities like ours, who just happen to have unseen powers, are especially appealing to us, for we can identify with them. The article went on to say we use heroic stories to inspire us and to motivate us and to transfer cultural values to us. And isn't that the value of our heroes of faith in the Bible? They inspire us. They motivate us. They teach us godly values. Undoubtedly, the greatest hero of our faith is Jesus. I want to encourage you to imitate him. If you can choose just one of his great virtues to imitate, choose this one: to love one another. Jesus was the Lord of compassion. In John 13:34, he said, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another." In other words, he's saying, I want you to imitate me. I'm a loving person. I want you to love one another the same way. And then in the next verse, in verse 35, he said, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus called this virtue, love for others, the second greatest commandment of all of God's commandments. He was the Lord of compassion. 10 times in the gospel accounts, we read that Jesus was filled with compassion, or that his heart went out to someone, or that he wept in sympathy for another person. Sometimes it was for an individual, or sometimes it was for a crowd of people. We are going to look at 2 incidents in which Jesus had that compassion this morning, and hopefully learn to imitate Jesus in compassion. If we are going to do that, to imitate Jesus in compassion, we must be compassionate like he was for people who have physical needs. We're going to look at a couple of minutes at a beginning of a story in Matthew 14. It tells us before those verses that we'll read what had just transpired. John the Baptist had just been put to death. The opening verses of our story tell us how Jesus felt about that and how he responded to that news. Let's read Matthew 14, verses 13 through 14. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Having compassion means putting another with their needs first. As I mentioned, the setting to this story is that John the Baptist had just been beheaded. It was a brutal killing, an undeserved killing. He was a righteous man who was fulfilling his God-given ministry. He was a good person, and yet he was put to death at a young age. You may not know, but John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin and his boyhood companion. They had grown up together. God appointed John the Baptist to be Jesus' promoter in ministry. He said, you go before him, you prepare the hearts of the people, you pave the way, for the kingdom of God is coming. You tell them that. And John did. And so not only was he a boyhood ally of Jesus, but he was a partner in ministry with him. And now he was dead. And Jesus was hurting. He needed time to deal with his feelings. He needed solitude. We read that he withdrew privately, that he looked for a solitary place. He needed to be alone. Jesus needed time to heal. He had always been the healer before, but now he was the one who needed healing. In order to find it, he had to get away from the crowds and the stress of people continually coming to him. Jesus, heal my illness. Jesus, meet my need. Jesus, help me with this problem. Person after person, very stressful, giving and giving and giving. Jesus needed to get away from that for a while to heal up by himself, but he couldn't. You see, crowds were always attracted to Jesus, the miracles he performed, the healings that he did, the wisdom with which he taught, the great love that he had. That drew people. They followed him from place to place. And he thought he was getting away from the crowds by crossing the Sea of Galilee, an 8-mile distance from one shore to the other. He would get across, go up into the hills and mountainside, find some solitude, pray, spend some time, grieve, cry. But when he landed, there was a great crowd awaiting him on the shore. How should he have responded to that? Anger, that he couldn't have a little time to himself. Disappointment that his needs weren't going to be met again? If he felt any of that, he pushed it aside. And verse 14 tells us how he responded. He had compassion on them and healed their sick. The Greek word for compassion in this verse is a word which literally can be interpreted twisted guts. It's kind of a gross image, isn't it? Why would the Bible put that word picture in our mind? Twisted guts. If someone came up to you and said, I have twisted guts for you, you say, you are sick. Get away from me. That's just a gross thought, isn't it? But yet we use terminology like that, don't we? Last week I told the story of the Andrea Gale. Remember the ship that had been lost at sea several years ago? The movie The Perfect Storm was made about it. And I set up the scene of the swamping of that boat by telling you, this is gut-wrenching. Gut-wrenching. What does that mean? Well, a wrench is a tool that you use to turn or twist a bolt or a nut off of or onto a bolt. It is gut twisting. That's what that word means. And we're not unfamiliar with that terminology. We understand what it means. When you have compassion, you hurt deeply for somebody inside. You feel pain for them. And we have phrases we use for that. This is eating me up, we say, when we're worried or anxious about someone else's problems. My heart aches for her, we say. And you've had that feeling for people, haven't you? A friend is hurting over some injustice, and it tears you up inside. A family member suffers, and your pain is so intense, you literally cannot sleep at night. A newscast shows children crying in hunger, and your heart just breaks. It's compassion. It causes you to feel that way. The gut-twisting care of a broken heart. We experience that when we carry emotional burdens for others. It is a godly thing to love so much that it hurts. Jesus was often physically moved to compassion. That's the reason he performed so many of his miracles and healings. That wasn't his mission. He didn't come into this world to heal us of our illnesses or to take care of our physical needs. But he did those things while he was on the way somewhere else because of his compassion. His compassionate heart forced him to stop and help. May we likewise respond in compassion when we see someone in need. Don't ignore the call you feel on your heart to stop and help someone. Don't refuse to reach out in love. Don't say to yourself, it's none of my business. I can't get involved with that. It's not my problem. Imitate your greatest hero and practice compassion. But we need to know that there is a cost to being compassionate. You see, when we are compassionate enough that we stop and help, we permit our lives to be interrupted for someone else. When Jesus landed on the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, he found not the afternoon he sought. He wanted loneliness. He wanted quiet time. He wanted some time to heal up. Instead, he found another great crowd waiting for him. His schedule for himself was going to have to be interrupted once again. He needed private time, but he saw some who had greater needs, and so he met them. There is encouragement for us in this story. When you think your problems are too insignificant to bother God with, or when you think that God has more important things to do than to listen to your petty prayers, you remember this story. You remember that Jesus makes time for us. There is also a challenge in this story. It's issued to us, but it was initially issued to the disciples, as we see in verses 15 and 16. It says, as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." But Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." Jesus was trying to teach them to practice compassion even if it cost them. And so we are called. Hebrews 13:3 tells us to empathize with people. It says, "Remember those in prison as if you were there yourself. Remember also those being mistreated as if you felt their pain in your own bodies." That's compassion. Actor and writer Peter Ustinov once said, "Charity is more common than compassion, for charity is tax deductible, but compassion is time consuming." He's right. And I would add that compassion is also heart rending. There is a cost to being compassionate. Jesus was always willing to pay it. And so should be his followers. This is how people will know we are Christians. When we follow the example of our compassionate Lord. Be compassionate toward those who have physical needs. And like Jesus, be compassionate toward those who have spiritual needs. We're going to go to another example of Jesus' compassionate heart. This one a few chapters before Matthew chapter 14. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 9. And we will read there that Jesus is on a preaching and teaching tour. And as he always did, he allowed his mission to be interrupted to meet the physical and physical needs of those who came to him. But it also tells us that Jesus was able to see the spiritual needs of those crowds of people. And it teaches us to look through his eyes. Let's go there. Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 and 36. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. The point that's being made here in these verses is that without Christ, without the good shepherd in our lives, we are lost. We are like sheep without a shepherd, wandering, lost, no purpose, no aim, no sense of direction. The word shepherd is often applied in the scriptures to either God or Jesus. And since we know Psalm 23 starts out with these words, "The Lord is my shepherd." At least 24 other times in scriptures, that word is applied to the characteristic of God or of Jesus. And by the same token, people in the Bible are often depicted as lost or endangered sheep. Jesus saw the crowd of people as being harassed and helpless. They were under assault. They were under spiritual assault. The word for harassed that's used in that verse is a word which was used to describe a predator attacking a flock of sheep and leaving them torn and bleeding. And the point is that without the good shepherd, we will be destroyed. We need a compassionate Lord. Aren't you glad you know that Jesus? The one with a heart of compassion? The Jesus who will feel for you and weep for you as he did for Mary and Martha at the tomb of their brother. The Jesus who will come to you and embrace you and help you when no one else will, like he did the leper. The Jesus who will help put the pieces of your life back together as he did with the widow who lost her only child. The Jesus who will allow his schedule to be interrupted for you like he did for so many others. He is the Lord of compassion. He is your Jesus. But he alone is not enough. I'm sure that last sentence sounds sacrilegious to your ears. But Jesus himself made a statement similar to that. He tried to teach in the next verses that without Christian compassion in this world, there is not enough help for all the people who need it. And so Jesus made a prayer request of all those who would be his followers. I stopped to think, if we'd ever received a prayer request from Jesus that we put on our screen. I don't think we ever have. But if we had, if Jesus had given us a prayer request and we put it on that screen, don't you think we'd treat it with much more importance than we normally do? We wouldn't just make a mental note and file it away and then forget about it as we left the building after the service was over. We would dedicate ourselves to praying for that thing which Jesus asked us to pray about. He did give us a prayer request in this story in Matthew 9. It's found in verses 37 and 38 when he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." I want to encourage you to pray that prayer. Lord, send harvest workers. There aren't enough for all the harvest that needs to be brought into you. Are you aware that there is a current emergency in the kingdom of God? There are not enough millennials going into the preaching and church leading ministry to fill all the spots that are being vacated by the baby boom generation that is dying and retiring. And so consequently, there are too many pulpits that are left unfilled. Churches without ministers. Some of those churches have and others will close as a result of that. You pray that prayer. Lord, send harvest workers. But understand that veiled in that prayer request, Jesus also made a plea. He made a plea to you and to me to be those compassionate harvest workers. It's difficult to do, for it is painful. We normally try to avoid emotional pain, and so we'll avoid emotional, painful situations, and we will avoid emotionally pain-producing people. It is often painful to minister to others, for we have to interject ourselves into their pain. We have to hurt with them. Several years ago, a student at East Canton High School was killed in an auto accident. The high school principal called on ministers from the Louisville and East Canton churches to meet with students at the school to provide them some words of hope and some words of comfort and words of informal counseling. I responded to that call, as did about 8 or 10 other clergy members. When I arrived in the gymnasium, I noticed that in the center of the gymnasium were several tables set up, and there were several students sitting at most of those tables. And almost every one of those tables was students only. No clergy member was sitting with them. I saw that the clergy members had been standing around the perimeter of the gymnasium, talking to themselves. I noticed that most of them were young, and I reasoned that they were probably inexperienced. They were waiting for the teens to approach them instead of going to the teens. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to say. But I thought to myself, you guys need to get in here with these kids. That's where Jesus would be. I sat down beside a weeping girl and offered her words of encouragement and sympathy. I asked to pray with her, and she accepted that invitation. We talked for a few minutes after the prayer, and she regained her composure. So I went from there to a table filled with teens with no adult sitting with them. I asked them each to tell me how they knew the deceased young men, and a few of them opened up. Then I led them in an exercise of writing a letter to that young boy and saying the things they would like to say to him. And then I encouraged them to take that letter home and to burn it, so that symbolically the words of that letter could go up in the smoke. So they spent several minutes doing that. All the while, the other clergymen were all standing around and watching. I was embarrassed to be a pastor that day. For the example of the majority of us was not like Jesus. I have to admit, it was awkward inserting myself into the grief of those students. It was painful sharing that grief with them. But it's what Jesus would have done. And it's what he calls us to do. Galatians 6:2 tells us, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. That law, to love one another as I have loved you. So you pray, Lord, send workers into the harvest fields, and you be prepared to be an answer to that prayer yourself. The story is told of a cathedral in Strasbourg, France, which was bombed in World War II. The statue of Jesus had been damaged in the blast. There's a picture of it you can see for yourself. It had originally depicted Jesus reaching out to the worshipers with the inscription that said, "Come unto me." But as you can see in the photo, his hands were destroyed in that blast. The members of the church decided not to repair the statue. Instead, they changed the inscription to read, "He has no hands but ours." We are his hands. May he reach out through us. We are his mouth. May he speak words of hope through us. We are his eyes. May he see the needs around us through us. We are his heart. May he love through us. Jesus is reaching out to our world through us. But before he reaches out through you, he will reach out to you in compassion for your spiritual needs. In love, he died to provide for them. And so, with outstretched hands, Jesus pleads, "Come to me. Come to me. Come to the Lord of compassion." If you would accept that invitation, we invite you to come forward and accept him as your Lord this morning.